I've got a brand new product to show you, and it's super pretty, and it's going on the front of this blanket box, which at first glance might look okay, but it's actually completely useless because it's got no base. What good is a blanket box without a base? You can't store anything in it, it's pointless. It's also pretty dirty. 2 of the legs were also heavily damaged, so I had to take the legs off and completely replace all 4. I also put a new base in the bottom as well so that you can actually store something in. The little bit of detail that's on the front of the box was just basically a very thin piece of wood that was stuck on, and that's where I'm going to put my decoupage paper. So that just came off with a scraper and I sanded it smooth. Then I primed with Dixie Belle's Bond Emboss. You don't have to sand with this product because it's an adhesion primer and a stain blocking primer in one. The colour that I'm going to use is Smoky Mountains, which is a really nice shade of muted green with undertones of blue and grey. That sounds very fancy, but it's a very nice muted green. And then the panel that's on the front of the blanket box where I'm going to apply my decoupage paper, I undercoated in white because I always do that under decoupage. And then once it was dry, I could get the brand new decoupage paper out. This is it. It's called Peaceful Peonies. The print is huge, as in the scale itself is big, and the actual size of the paper is massive as well. So I just trimmed it down, and I'm going to keep the offcut for a different project because there's far too much paper there to throw away. All the offcuts get used for something eventually. And then I stuck the piece of decoupage paper down with Dixie Belle's Satin clear coat, and I also sealed it with exactly the same product as well. That's going to help protect the paper. Once it was dry, I then trimmed it down with a craft knife. I always do this when it's dry because the paper is less likely to tear once it's dried. And then because this vintage blanket box was kind of a bit battered and not perfect, I'm just going to blend the edge where the paper meets the paint to give a kind of softer look. So I used a dry brush and just literally ran that across the edge of the paper. And again, that's going to kind of just soften that harsh edge up a little bit and just give it a bit more faded vintage look. Here's a little close-up of that gorgeous paper on the front of the blanket box, a reminder of what the piece looked like before, and here's the after. This blanket box lived with me for a few years. I'd already painted it in a very deep charcoal grey colour, but unfortunately part of the trim got damaged, probably in a very heated board game session or something, I don't know, but it had to come off. It just popped off really easily. I gave it a really good clean because we are disgusting in this house, and then I sanded everywhere smooth. And I wanted to give it a little bit of detail on the front because without that decorative trim it was kind of boring and plain Jane. So I opted for a raised stencil. For this I'm going to use a stencil, and I'm going to use a product called Dixie Mud, which is like a paste consistency. You just apply it over your stencil, remove the stencil while the Dixie Mud is still wet, and leave it to dry, and it will take the shape of your stencil. I sanded any rough bits down smooth, and then I undercoated everything in Dixie Belle's Silk All-in-One mineral paint in a white shade. I did this because I wanted a completely blank canvas because I wanted to create a kind of watercolour effect. And for this, I'm going to use Dixie Belle's Terra clay paint, which is a really unique paint. It's completely different to any other paint that I have painted with, and you can achieve loads of different artistic kind of effects with it. So I first started out by layering up some warm toned colours, and I used lots of water to kind of give a drippy effect, and then I used some deeper tones to add a little bit of shading, and just kept adding lots of water to kind of get that paint to drip down. As you can see, the paint is really pigmented, so I didn't need a lot here at all. And if you know me, you know that I love a little bit of turquoise, so that is going to be the star of the show. This is called Lani's Lagoon, and in my opinion it really is the perfect turquoise. It's so pretty and vibrant, so I put that as the main colour, but I also wanted the other colours to be kind of visible underneath it as well to give that kind of watercolour effect. So I used lots of water to encourage the paint to drip down, and I also rubbed back some of the areas of the turquoise on the raised stencil a little bit as well, so you could just see those colours underneath be a little bit more prominent. The good thing about this paint is that it is reactivated really easily with water. As long as it hasn't been sealed, you can reactivate this paint even if you go back to it weeks later. So it is a really artistic paint. As you can see, I'm just rubbing the surface with a damp rag, and that is lifting the turquoise and revealing the colours underneath. I also reintroduced some of the warmer tones using a palette knife, and I just scraped it really lightly over the raised stencil, which is going to help kind of pull it all together and enhance that pattern and give a really multicoloured bohemian look. Again, I just used a little bit of water to encourage that to drip down the blanket box a little bit. This paint does need sealing. It's porous until you've done so I used a water-based top coat to seal it. Here's a couple of close-ups of the finished piece. You can just see all the colours popping through the turquoise there and contrasting against it. Here's a reminder of the before, and here's the after. Blanket boxes are one of my favourite things to paint. They always make good little projects. This one was especially pretty because it had some lovely legs and it had some really nice detail on the front. But that's not to say it didn't throw a few curveballs in my direction, as is always the case with vintage furniture. The veneer on the underneath of the lid needed stripping off completely, but we'll put that to one side and I can do a separate video on that if that's something that you want to see. But I'm just going to concentrate on the painting for this video. So once I'd taken that lid off and taken it into somewhere else to make a mess and strip the veneer, I started out by cleaning this piece all over with Dixie Belle's White Lightning, which is pre-mixed into the spray bottle. I sprayed it straight onto the surface and then gave it a good scrub with a microfiber cloth. Always make sure you do the underneath of your pieces as well, because that's always where cobwebs and dust gathers. Once I'd given it a good old scrub to get rid of the grime on the surface, I rinsed it with clean water and then gave it a scuff sand with my electric sander on most parts. I just had to get in there with a bit of hand sanding for the legs and the detail. And then there was some damage on the front, some dings and scratches, so I filled that in with Dixie Belle's Dixie Mud. When that Dixie Mud had dried, I sanded it smooth and then I could get on with painting. Now, I am going to be using silk mineral paint, which does have a stain blocking primer built into the paint, but I decided to prime this with Boss, which is the product that I'm using now. That's a water-based stain blocking primer and it is compatible with silk mineral paint if you did want to prime first. Usually if I was using chalk mineral paint, I'd do a couple of coats of this primer, but I'm using silk mineral paint, which already does have that stain blocking primer built into it, so I only did one coat of primer and then I gave it a really light sand with a Dixie Belle sanding sponge just to make sure it was super smooth. The colour of the paint that I'm using is called Deep Sea and it's a really deep inky navy blue. It's absolutely stunning, and as you can see, the coverage is phenomenal. I'm just using a synthetic brush to apply this because my customer has asked for a one colour finish on this, so no kind of arty fartiness or crazy colours. It's just going to be a really classy one colour finish. As with the primer, once that first coat of paint was dry, I did sand it lightly in between the first coat and the second coat. Again, this is just to get that really super smooth finish that my customer has asked for. It just gives you the opportunity to make sure everything is nice and smooth in time for your second coat. Before you apply your second coat, just make sure you've given your first coat sufficient drying time. The usual drying time for silk mineral paint is between 2 and 4 hours, so just make sure you give it enough time before you recoat with your second. The second coat is going on exactly the same way as the first, with a synthetic brush for a nice smooth finish. And my favourite feature about silk mineral paint is that you don't have to top coat because it has one of those built into the paint as well. Here's a close-up of the interior, which I treated with Big Mom's butter, and here's a close-up of that super smooth finish that I got with silk mineral paint. Here's a little reminder of how the piece started out, and here's the finished result.